If it's Thursday, Chuck's exclusive interview with Ukraine's prime minister as the U.S. and Russia face off in a United Nations meeting, and President Zelensky delivers an emotional plea for more aid and more accountability. Plus, an appeals court grants prosecutors access to key evidence in the criminal investigation into classified documents seized at Mar-a-Lago, as former President Trump comes under increasing pressure in federal, state, and congressional investigations. And massive, deadly, and historic anti-government protests are growing in Iran after a young woman dies in the custody of the so-called morality police. We've got a report from Tehran ahead. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in New York, where it has been another day of major developments at the United Nations, with more heated and defiant rhetoric from Russia and new nuclear saber-rattling, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken and other Western diplomats demanded accountability for Russia's actions. Today, here in New York, Chuck sat down for an exclusive interview with Ukraine's prime minister to discuss the very latest developments in the war. We will show you some of that interview in just a moment. But first, amid new threats from Russia to use nuclear weapons to defend its territory, Secretary of State Blinken called on every UN Security Council member to stand up to Putin and send a, quote, clear message that Russia must stop the threats.
Rather than change course, however, President Putin has doubled down, choosing not to end the war, but to expand it, not to pull troops back, but to call 300,000 additional troops up, not to ease tensions, but to escalate them through the threat of nuclear weapons, not to work toward a diplomatic solution. The very international order that we have gathered here to uphold is being shredded before our eyes. We cannot, we will not allow President Putin to get away with it.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was not at the Security Council meeting. During that speech, Lavrov entered the meeting only to echo Russian propaganda justifying the war, falsely claiming Ukraine had become a, quote, completely totalitarian Nazi-like state. He then walked out. A U.S. official tells NBC News that Lavrov's antics were, quote, another sign of weakness and a sign Russia recognizes that it's becoming increasingly isolated on the world stage. All of this comes as Russians take to the streets protesting Putin's calls for the mobilization of an additional 300,000 reserve troops. Extraordinary scenes playing out there across Russia. And it comes a day after Ukrainian President Zelensky received a standing ovation for his speech before the UN General Assembly, a speech in which he urged the UN to hold Russia accountable for its actions, while laying out the assistance he says he desperately needs to win the war.
We need defense support, weapons, military equipment and shells. Offensive weapons and long-range one is enough to liberate our land, and defensive systems, above all air defense. And we need financial support to keep internal stability and fulfill social obligation to our people.
And as I mentioned, Chuck sat down today with Ukraine's prime minister right here in New York and began by asking him about Russia's recent troop mobilization and whether he sees it as Putin acknowledging that Ukraine is winning this war.
I think that for now, all of the world have seen successes of Ukraine in north regions, in Kharkiv region, some small successful operation in Kherson, on south of Ukraine. We will continue. We have no other choice. For us, win and victory in this war is a question of existence of our nation. So we have no other way. And as our president said, we all are united, so much united inside of Ukraine, politically, like society, volunteers, all of us very united in sense of future victory of Ukraine in this war. And we also ask world, civilized world, unite for our victory, because yesterday in President's speech in Assembly General of United Nations, he mentioned that 101 countries support Ukraine in the resolutions, and only 7 countries vote against of this resolutions against of support of Ukraine, and they support Russia. But this is a ratio, and it demonstrates how the world is united for Ukrainian victory, for finish of this war, because this war is influenced on all the countries all around the world, and it's very important to be, I will repeat it again and again, to be united in support of Ukraine in this absolutely bloody war from Russia's side.
The urgency of this moment in this respect, it is clear what Putin is trying to do is drag this war out, right? He is hoping to wait out, hope the West tires, get to the winter, if you will. What do you want the allies to do? The United States, support is one thing, military weapons is another. What do you need right now to thwart this strategy of essentially getting to the winter and creating a stalemate?
I always say to win this war, we need 3 main things: weaponry, finances, and sanctions. Weaponry, let us protect ourselves and to go into ahead to make these counteroffensives, very successful counteroffensives with support of our partners. But we also need sanctions, because Russia now earn enough money on the gas and oil prices. So we need more effective sanctions to stop fulfilled Russian terrorist country budget. We also ask our partners to recognize Russia as a terrorist country, because all what they are doing in Ukraine, so it's just genocide. This is like terrorist acts in all the levels. You see Bucha, Irpin, now you see the Kharkiv region, Izum, it's the same situation, mass graves, killing of civilians, women, children. They bomb civilian objects, they make rocket missiles, shelling of nuclear power station, nuclear blackmails in Zaporizhia power station, also bring all of us to the fear. All of the world, especially European continent, is afraid that this station, which is now using by Russians like washing machines, it's turning on and off every day, and it's impossible regime for nuclear object.
Is there something more that you think the United States or NATO should do in this moment to deal with this nuclear blackmail? Or do you think he's just saber-rattling? You know, he's just using rhetoric?
So it's systematic activity of Russian Federation. First of all, they seized Chernobyl station and occupied this and blackmail all of us by Chernobyl nuclear power station, and all the world know this name Chernobyl.
Yes, we do.
Then they go to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in on the European continent. Yep. It's like 6 of Chernobyls in the one place. And then 3 days ago, they begin to shell by rockets Pivdenno-Ukrainska nuclear power plant in Mykolaiv region. And it's also like blackmail that all the nuclear objects of Ukraine, and we have 5 nuclear power stations, could be used like nuclear weaponry on the European continent. And this is really danger, because now they have absolutely out of the age of risks. They bring all of us to this huge risk of nuclear disaster.
Really great interview by Chuck there. And for reaction to it and for more on where this war is headed, I'm joined now by retired Admiral James Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander and an NBC News Chief International Analyst, and Bill Taylor, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and the Vice President for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thanks to both of you for being here on this very busy Thursday. I want to get both of your reactions to what we just heard from the Prime Minister. And Ambassador Taylor, let me just start with you and put this question to you about saber-rattling. What did you make of what we heard about whether Russia is saber-rattling, and what do you think Russia is up to?
Kristen, we've heard this saber-rattling before. This is not the first time President Putin or the Minister Lavrov has made these statements, irresponsible statements, and they've made them before, they're making them again. And they are trying to intimidate. And so far, they have not been able to do that. So far, even though they have laid down lines before, like certain kinds of weapons or certain attacks on Crimea, which they claim is part of Russia, no one else does, and the Ukrainians have violated those. The Ukrainians have gone ahead and fired at military targets in Crimea, and the weapons continue to flow. So we have to take this seriously, Kristen, of course, but it is irresponsible. We've seen it before, and we will probably hear it again. So far, there's no indication that they're going to use these weapons.
Admiral Stavridis, what do you make of the threats?
I'm with Ambassador Bill Taylor, my good friend. I think the odds of Putin using a nuclear weapon are extremely low. He can accomplish almost anything he could with a tactical nuclear weapon using his conventional forces, and he knows if he were to use a nuclear weapon, that enormous global swing vote, the 40 countries or so that the ambassador described that didn't sign up with Ukraine, or the 7 that were against them, but there's about 40, including India, South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil. That swing vote goes away the day a nuclear weapon is used. I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. I was struck by the way that old song, "Send money, guns, and lawyers," and that's exactly what the Ukrainians need, and we ought to continue to put the right weapons in their hands. I think we've done a pretty good job doing that. There's probably a few other systems you could talk about providing them, but we need to stay the course here because, as you heard Secretary Tony Blinken say, Putin has doubled down. Poker term, he's all in. And we're going to have to stand very firmly against him.
Well, and I want to follow up with you on that very point, because you did hear the Prime Minister renew calls for more military support, more economic support. Here we are entering the 7th month of this conflict, and President Biden's key goal in his speech at the United Nations, and as he's meeting with these leaders from allied nations, is to keep the United States allies unified around supporting Ukraine. But Admiral Stavridis, how complicated does that get because this war is dragging out? And I guess to Chuck's point, how long does it seem Russia's willing to wait? Is there a concern that there's no end in sight for Russia?
I think Putin's burn rate in troops killed and grievously wounded, 80,000 and rising, destroyed tanks, destroyed armor, equipment gone, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet on the bottom of the Black Sea. All of that is burning, burning, burning. On the other side, Kristen, your point, President Zelensky has to deal with ensuring the patience of the West continues. Putin certainly will wait to see how this winter plays out as he turns off the taps of gas and puts the Europeans in a very cold winter. I think the Europeans will stand strong in the face of that because they know they can't continue year after year to bend a knee to Vladimir Putin. Bottom line in all this, this will go on for some months, but those two burn rates, I think, will eventually lead to a conversation, a negotiation 6 months from now, 10 months from now, a year from now. This is not going to go on for years, but certainly for months to come.
So, Ambassador Taylor, let's talk about how this may or may not come to an end. Chuck did ask the Prime Minister about that, about a potential diplomatic resolution. Take a look at this. I'm going to get your reaction on the other side.
All the wars in human history were finished absolutely in diplomatic way. So there is no other way how to finish the war. In any way, it will finish on the table of negotiations and the table of signing some papers about the finish of this war.
Right.
And Ukraine always say that we would like to solve all the problem by diplomatic way. But Russia invade Ukraine. They would like to kill our nation, to make this genocide, this terrorism. We understand that now there is no other way liberate our territories and to go to negotiations when the Russia will agree to leave our territory so we can have this diplomatic finishing of this war. But Russia should make this first step. They should leave our territories, and then we will sign all the needed diplomatic papers.
And when you say territories, does that include Crimea?
Absolutely. We should have all our territories in the borders of 1991, which are international recognized. So this is...
No talks until then, right?
I think that Russia should make first step. They should leave our territories, and then we will discuss, we will sign all the papers, we will ask international community to give the guarantees of security for Ukraine, because Russia will our neighbor for the next future 1,000 years. They are our neighbor, and we would like to have guarantees from international community, from civilized countries for next periods. And then we will sign papers with Russia. But now, Russia, we make dozens of trials to have negotiations with Russia. But every time, Russia brings us ultimatums about capitulation and about surrendering. But it's not about diplomatic way of solving of this.
Ambassador Taylor, what do you make of that? Is that realistic to say that Russia has to leave Crimea before Ukraine will even come to the negotiating table? Is that possible?
President, it's certainly possible. And it is what the Ukrainians have said over and over. That is, all Russians have to leave Ukraine. They don't say it has to happen tomorrow or in the first phase. They say all Russians have to leave. This is what sovereignty is. This is territorial integrity. That's what they're after. Russians should not be rewarded for invading their neighbor. And they've been very clear. The Ukrainians have been very clear that in the end, they want total sovereignty of their nation, all the Russians out. Now, that said, the prime minister's been clear. Yesterday, the president was clear. There are things that need to happen before these negotiations get started. One is we're talking about how to get the weapons to the Ukrainians so that they can continue this fight, so they continue this successful counteroffensive that they are winning. They're winning again. They won around Kyiv in the beginning, and they're winning around Kharkiv right now. So they have the momentum. And there are other things that the Ukrainians say they need. They need punishment for the Russians to be sure that they are punished for this. They need reparations from the Russians. The Ukrainians have made it very clear they're not interested in neutrality. That had been on the table at one point before. The prime minister mentioned these earlier negotiations. After Bucha, after Irpin, after Kharkiv, after Izum, there's no talk of neutrality. There's no talk of negotiations until the Russians leave. So yes, Kristen, I think it's realistic over time to get all the Russians out of Ukraine.
Admiral Stavridis, final word to you. What is your take on this? And as Ambassador Taylor says, Ukraine has the momentum right now. Is it too much to say that they're winning the war right now? How would you characterize this moment?
I think it is too much to say they're winning the war, but they have certainly turned the tables on the Russians. And we're kind of in phase 3, if you will. Phase 1, the Russians failed to take Kyiv. Phase 2, the Russians go back to a static defensive line, but they take Mariupol. Phase 3, the Ukrainians are on the march. Having said that and applauding it, I think it's going to be a very tall military order to drive the Russians out, particularly of Crimea. And we got to do all we can to give the Ukrainians the tools so they can bring themselves to that negotiating table in the strongest possible way, Kristen.
All right. Well, it's such a fantastic conversation. Admiral Stavridis and Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much. And you can catch more of Chuck's interview with Ukraine's Prime Minister on Meet the Press this Sunday. You don't want to miss that. And coming up, federal prosecutors regain access to key classified documents at the center of their criminal investigation into former President Trump's mishandling of top secret information. Plus, unrest intensifies in Iran as women take to the streets burning their headscarves in defiance of Iran's morality police. We'll delve into that. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Federal prosecutors can now officially resume using the classified documents seized from Mar-a-Lago in their criminal investigation. The judge overseeing the documents amended her order today after an appeals court ruling late yesterday overturned the order that was preventing the Justice Department from quickly accessing classified material it had seized from former President Trump's Florida estate. It was one of several legal setbacks for the former president this week. Hours earlier, New York's Attorney General announced she was suing him, his 3 children, and their company for alleged business fraud. And the House January 6th committee into the former president has announced it will release new evidence in a hearing next week, potentially its last. I'm joined now by David Priest, a former intelligence officer at the CIA, who's now the publisher at COO at Lawfare. Thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. So let's just start with these developments overnight, this appeals court ruling to essentially say to the Justice Department, you can now view those classified materials without a third party intervening. How big of a move is this by the appeals court?
Thanks, Kristen. It is a big move, and it's frankly the move that should have been there from the beginning. No reasonable court could rule otherwise on the fundamental issue of the government's access to its own information in a case like this. But it does mean that the core investigation, the core issue of finding out who had these documents, who might have had access to them during the intervening months at Mar-a-Lago, can proceed, because now they can move forward and start asking witnesses questions like, did you see a document on this topic? Now, that topic itself might be classified, but they can work with that now, and they can actually try to figure out, was there some breach of national security because these documents were being stored improperly?
Based on what we know about former President Trump, he is not afraid to engage in a legal battle. Do you expect that he and his team of lawyers will appeal this decision? Do you expect this to go all the way to the Supreme Court? And what could that potentially mean about the timeline of this investigation?
On this classified documents part of it, they have no other choice. If they're going to appeal, then go to the Supreme Court. The rules of the 11th Circuit preclude the option of going to the full court instead of just the 3-judge panel that has already ruled. So, yes, it would have to be a Supreme Court appeal. There's very little to appeal on, however. If you look at the details of what the 11th Circuit ruled, they really dismantled the argument that there is even an issue regarding declassification, what it could mean. There is no reasonable window for this to be considered personal property, even if you were to grant the former president the idea that he did somehow, by thought, declassify these documents. That still means they're government property. They're just declassified government property. So I'm not sure what the appeal to the Supreme Court would do, other than perhaps delay it a bit more, but you would expect that this would be expedited if it did go to the highest court.
Well, we heard from the former president extensively overnight in an interview on Fox News. I want to play part of what he said in his defense and get your reaction on the other side.
It doesn't have to be a process, as I understand it. You know, there's different people say different things, but as I understand, there doesn't have to be. If you're the president of the United States, you can declassify just by saying it's declassified, even by thinking about it, because you're sending it to Mar-a-Lago or to wherever you're sending it. And there doesn't have to be a process. There can be a process, but there doesn't have to be. You're the president. You make that decision. So when you send it, it's declassified. I declassified everything.
So, David, first, to be clear, the appeals court was very blunt in what they wrote yesterday and said that his lawyers have never provided any evidence to show that he declassified that sensitive material. But what's the fact check there? There is a process, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of words there in what the former president said, but not a lot of meaning. Listen, there's no necessary process the president himself must follow to declassify documents. That is a process that when I was working at CIA or other government officials, must follow. But the president himself, as the ultimate classification and thus declassification authority, can do it in any way he wants. The problem is he has to make it known that he has done it. So the specific process can be varying for a president. But doing it by thought is just silly and not worthy of any further discussion, because there is no process of notifying people that it's happened if you just think it. Without any evidence of communication that these documents were declassified, they are not declassified. And I would add one more thing, that even if there were some evidence that they had been declassified, if the current administration says they are classified, and they had made that clear during the intervening 18 months with the former president, then they are classified again because the current president is the classification authority. So the whole thing, as the 11th Circuit said, is a red herring. The classification issue is almost a distraction. At minimum, it's a delay tactic. The core issue is whether stolen government property should have been at Mar-a-Lago and what happened each time they went back to try to get it, that there were obfuscations or false statements. That's what the investigation is really about, to figure out what happened and if anybody had access to these documents.
That's such an important clarification. 30,000-foot level. The former president is facing an unprecedented number of investigations that are swirling around him. This is just one of them. Of course, yesterday he was sued by New York's attorney general. How much legal jeopardy is he in at this point?
He's in severe legal jeopardy on several fronts. They're very different cases, right? So this one with the Mar-a-Lago documents is about the possession and possible cover-up of taking government property. The New York case is civil. It has nothing to do with his actual job as president when he had it. You've still got the Fulton County issue with the interfering with the electors, and of course you've got whatever comes out of the January 6th investigation involving incitement and other issues involving the insurrection. Those are four very different angles, and all of them could hit the president pretty severely.
David Priest, thank you so much. This is complicated stuff. We understand it a little bit more clearly now. Really appreciate your joining us. Thanks for your insights.
Thanks, Kristen.
Coming up next, much more on former President Trump and Congress's efforts to prevent another January 6th as threats to democracy become the top issue for voters less than 7 weeks until the midterms. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Former President Trump's influence on the Republican Party was on full display as the House passed a bill designed to prevent another January 6th by overhauling that 19th century law governing how electoral votes are counted. Notably, of the 9 Republicans who voted to reform the Electoral Count Act, none of them are on the ballot this November. 5 are retiring, including 4 who voted to impeach former President Trump following the attack on the Capitol. And the other 4 are going into forced retirement after losing primaries to Trump-backed challengers. This afternoon, the former president slammed the legislation and repeated his false belief the vice president could have stopped the election from being certified. Joining me now is PBS NewsHour correspondent Lisa Desjardins, Democratic strategist Doug Thornell, and Republican strategist Brendan Buck. Thanks to all of you. So great to see all of you. Wish we were in person, but I'm here in New York, so really appreciate it. Lisa, let me start with you. Let's talk about the vote in the House for the Electoral Count Act. What does the vote tell you? The fact that the Republicans who voted for it are not going to be in office in the new year.
Well, I think this is even sort of a lower bar to clear, or perhaps it should have been, than an impeachment vote against the former president, because this is really talking about an antiquated law from 1887 that nearly everyone agrees is too vague, open to misinterpretation, and propelled the country toward an insurrection just over a year ago. This is not about one candidate or one presidency. However, Trump and his allies behind the scenes have said that they see this as a loyalty test, and that's why you see all of the members, the Republicans who want to return, did not support this. However, I think we will see another vote on this because the House version passed yesterday is different than the Senate version. We all know the classic tale. I don't have to tell the 2 guys sitting there about this situation. It's going to come back to the House. Will this vote change after the midterms with a new version? Maybe 1 or 2 votes, but I think it's going to stay partisan like this in the House, bipartisan in the Senate.
Well, and you take me to my next question. And yeah, Brendan, please.
Sorry. The bill in the House, what we should remember, was co-authored by Liz Cheney. And so I think one of the dynamics that was going on here is Liz Cheney has become somewhat toxic among House Republicans. And so I think that probably pushed down the number. There are probably a lot of Republicans in the House who do think that the Electoral Count needs to be reformed. But because it had Liz Cheney's name on it, they just couldn't vote for it. So I do think that whenever a Senate bill comes over to the House and it's got a bit more of a bipartisan impetus on it, you'll see a much bigger number in the House, because I think a lot of Republicans are concerned about what happened on January 6th and don't want to see that happen again.
Yeah, it's a really important point. Please jump in, Doug.
One thing on what my friend Brendan said, I agree with that. I do think there's some Liz Cheney piece there, but I also think, well, look, we're 7 weeks from an election. Republicans, I think, are terrified about Trump jumping down their throats. And look, this is part of the transition of the Republican Party away from what, Lisa and Brendan and I remember it to be about 10, 15 years ago, to being controlled by MAGA Republicans, where it's all about conspiracy theories, lies, and extreme efforts to control power. And I think that with Trump, you saw Trump come out on it today. I think the last thing a lot of these Republicans want in these places that are competitive, even though they may disagree with him, is to get in a fight with him. And so that's what I think you saw. You saw some of the, what has become like sort of a lack of courage within the Republican Party to stand up to Trump, and they fell in line.
Let's talk about the state of the Republican Party. And Brendan, I'm going to go to you on this one first, because yesterday we saw the legal problems pile up for former President Trump. Now, on the one hand, some of his allies say, look, this is just galvanizing his supporters. It's adding energy to him to potentially announce another run in 2024. But for more establishment Republicans, Brendan, is there a trepidation that this is coming less than 2 months before the midterms, when Republicans want to be talking about the economy and inflation?
Well, first, I don't think there are a lot of establishment Republicans left. But to your point, absolutely. The last thing they want is Donald Trump back in the headlines right now. Republicans want this election to be a referendum on Joe Biden and the economy. It's that simple. That's the issue they want this to be about. Now, Democrats want it to be about abortion and threats to democracy and other issues. Republicans want a referendum. When Donald Trump is on the stage, he creates a choice. He reminds people of what the Republican Party has become. And that is not the contrast that Republicans are looking for. So that, yes, we would love to have him just go away for a little while. We know he's not going away forever. We know he's probably coming back to run for president. But you have heard that even his own closest advisors have said, hold on, just wait until after the election. We don't need to get you in the middle of this. This complicates things for the House, but also, speaking more to language that resonates with him, he doesn't want to be blamed if something goes wrong in the midterms and people suggest that it was his fault that Republicans lost.
Lisa, what's your take here? What's your reporting tell you about how the former president is viewing all of this and the timing of a potential run? As Brendan says, a lot of people in his ear saying, just wait a little longer until we get through these midterms.
No doubt, expectations are that the former president is going to run again. However, I think that those dynamics are complicated. I know many Trump supporter Republicans, voters that I've talked to, and lawmakers here who want to move on, who are looking at Ron DeSantis, looking at other Trump-like figures that they think won't exhaust independence in the way that they think President Trump has. But, guys, I'm looking at places like North Carolina, where I'm going tomorrow, and so is former President Trump. He's going there because Ted Budd thinks he can help him with the base. New Hanover County, that's near Wilmington, that's near the coast of North Carolina, talking to sources today involved in that race, they want Trump to turn out that rural base that's very hard to get to, going door to door in those areas. But he is someone that can draw out that kind of hard red right. Now, what they are worried about is stuff like we saw at his previous rally, signaling or openly kind of maybe even endorsing QAnon theories. They're worried about that being a continued problem with especially suburban women voters. So it is a bit of a rolling of the dice, but Ted Budd tomorrow believes that President Trump, on the whole, is going to help him in the eastern part of North Carolina.
Yeah, there's no doubt his support is strong in some of those areas. Doug, let's talk about the current president. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was asked about President Biden and his potential for running again in 2024. Here's how she responded when she was asked about that.
President Biden is the president of the United States. He did a great service to our country. He defeated Donald Trump. Let's not forget that. If you care about the air we breathe, the water we drink, the education of our children, jobs for their families, pensions for their seniors, any subject you can name. I'm not going into politics about whether the president should run or not.
Doug, she's the Speaker of the House. Why is that such a hard question for a number of Democrats to answer?
Well, I mean, the president himself hasn't, said, that he's definitely going to run. I think he would be our strongest candidate if he decided to run for re-election. He's got a I think, a strong legislative record to run on, and we'll see. And I think the economy, we'll see where it is in a year or two. But look, I think that Democrats right now want to, Brendan laid out sort of what Republicans want this race to be about. And Democrats are wanting it to be about the opponents that they're running in a lot of these places. Dr. Oz, J.D. Vance, Blake Masters, Herschel Walker. These people are very vulnerable Republicans who have very extreme views on issues related to choice and Social Security. And so the president, actually, his approval numbers are right around 45, 46. They're increasing. But when you look at these races, if you go race by race in some of these states, these Republicans are very weak. And I think Democrats don't just want it to be about a conversation about abortion and democracy. They want it to be a choice between them and the opponent they're running against, because their opponents that they're running against are way outside the mainstream and very extreme. And we're seeing it all over the country that they're having a hard time capitalizing on what they thought was going to be a great environment for them.
All right, well, unfortunately, yeah, one last point. We're just out of time, but make one last point quickly.
Momentum is changing a little bit for Democrats. This is a tricky moment right now where some of these candidates are getting back on their feet. Mitch McConnell and his money has something to do with that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and we will leave it on that good point. Fantastic conversation, guys. Great to see you. Lisa, Doug, and Brendan, thank you. After the break, extraordinary scenes in Iran where anti-government protests are sweeping the country. We will take you there. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Anti-government protests in Iran are growing over the death of a 22-year-old woman while in custody of the country's so-called morality police. In response, Iranian women are protesting the streets in defiance of morality laws. Video from the protest shows many burning their hijabs and cutting their hair. Iran's authorities have responded with a violent crackdown. The AP reporting that at least 9 people have died since the protests began. NBC's Ali Arouzi filed this report from Tehran.
Widespread protests and clashes in Iran between Islamic Republic security forces and demonstrators angry over the death of a 22-year-old woman in police custody continue for a 6th consecutive day, engulfing almost 90 cities and towns across the country. According to state TV, at least 17 people have been killed so far. The scale and scope and nature of Iran's ongoing unrest is the worst since the Islamic Revolution in 1979 and is one of the most serious crises the ruling establishment have had to face in over 4 decades. At the heart of the issue is social freedoms, in particular women's rights. Women in Iran have to abide by a very strict dress code. If they don't, the punishment can be severe. The death of Mahsa Amini while being held by the morality police touched a raw nerve, culminating in these protests where women are burning their hijabs in public and running battles with security forces are constant. The police presence is massive. Authorities have all but cut off the internet and blocked apps like WhatsApp and Telegram so people can't mobilize or upload videos to share information about the government's rolling crackdown, a tactic the government often employs in times of unrest.
Ali Arouzi for us. I'm joined now by Jasmine Ramsey, Deputy Director for the Center for Human Rights in Iran. Thank you so much, Jasmine, for being here. Help us put this moment into context. You have these mass protests. You also have a death toll that is climbing, mass arrests. Do you see this as an inflection point for Iranians and for Iranian women in particular?
It's really important to note that this protest is a part of an evolution of the protest movement in Iran in the last 6 years. Members of all facets of society have been coming out and demanding their rights. And this time we're focused around women's rights. We're hearing chants of death to the dictator. Iranians are literally risking their lives to call for social and political change.
What do you want the West to understand about this moment? And what should we know about Mahsa Amini and her death?
It's very important to note two things about that. The first is world leaders, especially leaders that have relations with Iran, should call publicly and forcefully for the Iranian government to allow protests without the threat of lethal violence and arbitrary arrest. That kind of pressure matters. Iran needs the kinds of relations that it has, and its worst fear is if these kinds of leaders start speaking out against what we're seeing on the ground. Also, very important to note that Masa's father risked imprisonment by speaking to an Iranian Persian media outlet and directly disputing the version of events that the Iranian government has put out into the streets. And by the looks of it, the Iranian people don't believe the government either. He said that his child, who was visiting Tehran, died as a result of beatings in state custody after being arrested by the morality police. So it's important to hear his words as well.
Oh, it's so important, and we appreciate your bringing them to us. You heard Ali Arouzi talk about the fact that as part of these protests, women have been ripping off their hijabs, their head coverings that they've been required to wear since the 1970s. Put that into a broader context. What is the significance? What's the importance of that? And what's the impact?
After the Iranian Revolution, the government turned the hijab, which should be a choice, into a tool of political repression. And what we're seeing now on the streets are people, women, taking their hijabs off and standing side by side with men, calling for this compulsory hijab rule to be lifted because it is used as an excuse to repress women. That's why they have the morality police on the streets detaining women and anyone that's, not complying with this arbitrary dress code. So they're really presenting a serious challenge to one of the platforms of the Islamic Republic.
And we, of course, saw at the UN General Assembly this week President Biden saying he stood with the brave women of Iran. But what does the world need to do to help make this moment be one of actual change?
So it's important to note, yes, internet and phone access is very disrupted or shut off in various parts of the country. That's because the Iranian government really doesn't like to have a light on it when it's committing atrocities against the people. But the most important thing is to keep the coverage on. And again, for world leaders, especially those that have relations with Iranian officials, to call for an end to this force and to allow people to protest. This anger that you're seeing, it's the result of years and years of dealing with an unresponsive government that has only responded with repression.
Jasmine Ramsey, thank you so much for speaking to us about this potentially pivotal moment. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And still to come, recovery efforts and Fiona's aftermath. My one-on-one interview with Puerto Rico's governor as the island struggles to restore power for roughly 1 million people. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Hurricane Fiona has moved into the Atlantic Ocean and is expected to be brushed by Bermuda overnight. In the Caribbean, it has left a trail of damage in its wake, particularly in Puerto Rico. NBC News has been able to confirm with several sources a total of 8 deaths believed to be related to the storm. Puerto Rico's government is not officially tracking storm-related fatalities. And 4 days after Fiona made landfall, authorities say power still has not been restored for nearly 2/3 of the island. Another 33% are still without water, as the National Weather Service today issued a heat advisory warning of heat indexes exceeding 100 degrees. Continued land and mudslides have been reported as recently as this morning, blocking roads and impeding recovery efforts, leaving some residents to take matters in their own hands to collect water. Joining me now to discuss this is the governor of Puerto Rico, Pedro Pierluisi. Thank you so much, Governor. Really appreciate your joining me, and I'm so sorry for all that you are all going through.
Thank you, Kristen, for this interview. Actually, the connection is not that good, but I can get to the jugular here. As you reported, Hurricane Fiona hit Puerto Rico hard. It was at a tropical storm intensity till 2 p.m. on Monday. So it's been about 3 days. By now, the challenge we're facing is lack of electric service for roughly, you're talking about 62% of our population. We do have, now we have water service for up to 73% of our population. So that's the challenge. During the course of the day, a couple of generating units should be connected to our system. And so we should see a significant increase of customers getting electric service. And that's going to help the water service as well. So that's the immediate challenge. There was a lot of flood damage, as you have reported, and the visuals show it. And so this hurricane, the difference between this one and Maria is basically the rain. We got an extraordinary amount of rain. In some places up to 34 inches of rain. On average, it got to about 16 inches across the island. So that's what we're dealing with. The president declared a major disaster that activates all of FEMA's programs. The President Biden, just announced that the federal government will assume 100% of the emergency assistance for a period of 30 days. And we're working as a team with FEMA, meaning the government of Puerto Rico. NGOs are helping. So we are quickly on the recovery mode. And there's light at the end of the tunnel. But I told you about the challenges we face.
Governor, can you hear me? And we appreciate that. You can hear me. Okay, yes. Wonderful. I appreciate that and appreciate your patience as we deal with these technical issues. Let me just follow up with you on some of the points that you made. You talked about the urgency to restore power. When specifically can the people of Puerto Rico expect the power to be back on for the vast majority of residents who live there? And have you been able to reach all parts of the island yet?
Well, yes, I have been canvassing the island for the last couple of days. Yesterday, the FEMA administrator, Deanne Griswold, went to several towns with me to actually see the damage. You're talking about bridges collapsing, like at least 3 or 4 bridges collapsing. You're talking about 40 communities that were left pretty much isolated because of lack of access. And we're dealing with all of that. In terms of power, my expectation is that a majority of the customers should be getting their electric service by the end of the day today. That was my goal for yesterday. It wasn't met because of issues with our grid. But today, as I said before, several generating units should be connected to the system, and that should help. So the goal is to gradually increase the number of customers getting electric service. By now, as I said, water service was a big issue, still an issue. We roughly have about 70%, 72% of our people with water service. That should come up as the electric service is reinstated. So that's the immediate challenge we're facing.
I've seen past interviews with you in which you have said that Puerto Rico is now more prepared to deal with these types of storms. And yet, last year, this week, Puerto Rican-born Representative Velasquez of New York gave this prediction. He said, quote, if a hurricane today, Category 1, hits the island, it will not survive. The power grid will not survive. That is essentially the exact situation that played out this week. So what is your response to this? Was this inevitable? Well, and do you stand by the comments that you all were prepared enough?
Well, the reality is that whenever a hurricane hits any jurisdiction, you get a blackout. The question becomes how long it'll take you to restore the service. It's been 3 days since the brunt of this storm left Puerto Rico, stopped impacting Puerto Rico, and we're not where we want to be. But as I said, The majority of the customers should be getting their service before the end of the day, and it should continue to increase. The question was whether the grid would survive. Well, it did survive. There has been some damage to transmission lines, but most of the grid hasn't been affected. There will be towns in which there was a lot of damage in the distribution lines, and that'll take longer to fix, but we will fix it and we'll come back.
Governor Pierluisi, thank you. We are out of time, and our thoughts are with you and everyone in Puerto Rico. Thank you for being with us this hour. Chuck will be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, and if it's Thursday, it's a new episode of Meet the Press Reports, streaming right here on NBC News Now at 10:30 p.m. Eastern and available on demand on Peacock tomorrow. Now, Hallie Jackson Now starts right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.